Hey, Jamil.
Hello, Kranti. Very good to see you, my friend.
I saw you. This is Colin Gonzalez.
Hello, how you doing?
Hi, I'm okay.
Great to see you.
Great to see you too, Jamil. How nice. What things are happening?
Jamil, just give us a minute or so more. A few more colleagues are logging in.
Absolutely. And I'm sorry, I had to register, I guess, for the thing.
And I was trying to look up your mobile number to call you to just check in case you're still sleeping or something, because I realize it's really early in the morning.
No, I actually was just watching the destroying of the civilian building with the media organizations hosting me in Gaza, and I was like looking at what in what world you can justify bringing down a civilian high-rise building and turn it into a military object. And so I just was listening to Al Jazeera offices reporter, because Al Jazeera is actually based in that
one of those buildings, yes, they were evacuated.
So it's just distressing and just incredible. And even if people were evacuated, doesn't necessarily mean that this is not a serious violation of the laws of war. And we'll talk more about that. But I was just busy trying to see whether how were they going to justify it now. And I'm sure they're going to say, look, there's some offices there that were used by Hamas, and then everything becomes collective punishment, right?
And supposedly justified. Colin, should we start? Because I think there will be a lot of questions that will come in.
Yes, please, go ahead.
I wanted to thank everybody today from Human Rights Law Network and its partner organizations who have signed in here. I also wanted to thank Jamil for signing up for a very early morning call. And in the middle of very difficult personal times. On that note, I'll just share a little bit about Jamil, and I also wanted to talk about the context about what it meant for Indians to hear on the issue of Israel and Palestine. First about Jamil, Jamil's he's somebody I'm very fond of, and I wanted to say much more about how I came to meet him, and particularly during his first visit to India. I couldn't believe. Initially, when I looked at Jamil, I thought he was an American, but his skills in the markets around Delhi, and I was like, okay, there's more to this guy, and very, very interesting, and that got me interested about him and about his work. So Jamil Dakwar is the director of what we commonly know as the ACLU, which is the American Civil Liberties Human Rights Program. It's quite interesting. You have a civil liberties union, but you also have a division for human rights, which took me some time to wrap my head around. The human rights program of the ACLU was formed to really hold the US government accountable to its international human rights obligations and commitments. And they do this through research, documentation, public education, advocacy, and mitigation, somewhat similar to the HRLN model. Prior to joining the ACLU in 2004, Jamil worked at the Human Rights Watch, doing somewhat similar work, but focusing on torture, detention in Egypt, Morocco, Israel, and the occupied Palestinian territory. Before coming to the United States, he was a senior attorney with Adala, a leading human rights group in Israel, where he filed and argued human rights cases before Israeli courts and advocated before international forums. He's a graduate of the Tel Aviv University and the NYU School of Law. He's also an adjunct professor, lecturer at the John Day College of Criminal Justice. That's a bit about Jamil. For me personally, the issue about Palestine and Israel is very close to home, partly because I grew up in a college where we had a lot of Palestinians, and that had much to do with a very rich history of India and its solidarity for Palestinians and the construct of Palestine, but which has suffered in the last 10, 15 years. And me and Jamil were on a call on access to vaccines globally. And he shared the info yesterday about what was happening. And I thought it was, for us, the right moment to request him to come and share what he was reflecting on. And I just wanted to say this, there is no talking points to which we'd like Jamil to speak to, except what he really thinks the world needs to know and the perspective of a nation occupied and its people about what really needs to be said. Jamil, you can speak for however long you want, and if colleagues and friends have questions, they'll put in the chat, and we'll kind of populate that for you later. Colin, do you want to say a few words before we?
I want you, Kranti, before I say a few words later, I want you to introduce Sneha to him as the person who's organizing the lecture.
Oh, yeah. Sneha, Sneha, where are you? Sneha? Jamil, Sneha is a dear colleague who's in the Delhi office who anchors the whole Center for Constitutional Rights programs and the lecture series. And she's the one who will be coordinating with you all along. Yeah, can you just say hello and wave out or something?
Hi, Jamil. I'm not sure if I'm visible because there are a lot.
You are.
Okay. Thank you so much for agreeing at a short notice. And we have been doing some really good lectures, and this is our 16th this year. And we have really been looking forward to your lecture, because I think everything that has been happening has sort of pushed us to think about this. And it's very important for each of us to understand what is exactly happening, because most of the information that we have is through news reports, and there's a lot of questions about what is the situation and how are things turning out to be. So I think it's very, very important for each of us to understand and know things in a real time, as Kranti said. So thank you very much for sparing time, and as Kranti said, taking an early morning call to talk to all of us. Thank you so much.
And Jamil, from my side, I saw you many, many years ago, and I'm happy to see you again. And I and all my colleagues, we share your grief and possibly your anger at what's happening. And we'd all like to know what's happening. Thank you very much, Jamil.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It really warms my heart to see you all coming together in conversation with me. I first want to say also my heart is with you, and my full solidarity as India goes through one of the worst times in terms of fighting the COVID-19, and I hope that you stay safe, and I appreciate, given everything that's going on in your lives, that you are devoting time to talk to me about the situation in Palestine. Thank you for organizing this opportunity. I want to first start by saying that I will be speaking not in my ACLU capacity. Although I am a manager and I direct the human rights program at the ACLU, the ACLU mandate is limited to the United States and to its actions and policies. And we don't have really any mandate or policy to look at human rights violations overseas, unless they are perpetrated by the United States agents and so even though the United States obviously has a big role in the Middle East and particularly in supporting Israel, as a matter of a policy, we have not intervened or have not done any work in that space, even though there are other countries that's supported by the US in the region. Some of them are very, very serious violators of human rights other than Israel. However, I just want to say that speaking in my personal capacity, it's really informed by my experience as a Palestinian who was born and raised in Haifa, which is now Israel, present-day Israel. I moved to the United States about 20 years ago, but I maintained constant contact with my family and my friends and also the human rights community in that area. I have family members who live now in Haifa. My family comes from the Galilee, from the north of Israel or historic Palestine, And I'm very worried about the situation there, because there serious escalation in violence against Palestinians in particular, where we're seeing for the first time, and I will say more about this, we were seeing for the first time in a wave of hate crimes committed by Jewish Israeli mobs against Palestinian civilians and their properties. We have had something like that during the second Intifada in 2000. I was actually there working as a human rights lawyer for Adala, the legal center for Arab minority rights in Israel, which is at the forefront now of this struggle to defend the rights of Palestinians who live inside Israel. But what we've seen in the last few days is unprecedented, because it also showed and made it very clear that Palestinians really cannot rely on Israeli security forces, law enforcement, or police to defend them, because they are part of the problem. They are, in fact, given just yesterday or last couple of days, an authorization, full backing and authorization from the Israeli Prime Minister to act with no accountability, to use force, excessive force, against anyone and he called it anyone who is disturbing the law and order. And then he referenced in that very brief media interview or media press conference that there are nationalist elements in this fight, and he was essentially referring to the fact that Palestinian citizens of Israel had risen up and they have revolted against the decades-long history of oppression, of continuation of policies, even though they have taken different forms over the years. But it's always been about treating them as second-class citizens, as people who do not belong to this country. Their land, their collective memory, their history is not something to be protected. Rather, it is something to be violated. And so the Palestinians, particularly the youth in many cities inside Israel, what's so-called mixed cities, these are, and it's a little bit of a kind of misleading term, because mixed cities you would think that there's like a real equality in those mixed cities, or there's at least a sense of there's a parity and there's a same share of all resources and political power and ability to be living safely, etc. But in fact, since 1948, and many of those cities, from Jaffa, where it is now at the outskirts of Tel Aviv, Led, Ramle, Akka, and Haifa. These are all originally one of the most important parts of Palestine pre-1948, before Israel was established. They had hosted the most thriving civil society, the most important, the center of political, social, and economic power of the Palestinian people in Palestine. And during the course of the 1947, 48 till 49, during that year, particularly in 1948, and we are commemorating the Nakba, in fact, today, and there was a wholesale attack and dispossession on the Palestinian community in those cities. And many of them, thousands of them, in fact, hundreds of thousands, have become or became at the time refugees, were fled during the war. Many of those who fled were threatened by massacres which are already committed in other parts of Palestine, particularly in Deir Yassin in Jerusalem. There were very intentional and systematic propaganda to try to spread fear and terror among civilians. And there were also plans to push out Palestinian civilians. The former Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, who was assassinated by a Jewish extremist in the mid-90s, wrote in his memoir and described in detail how, as a military commander of the Zionist militia in 1948, he was one of the people who ordered the deportation, the forced deportation and displacements of Palestinians from Led. So these towns that you're hearing about in the news, again, Led, which is called in Hebrew Lod, but it's really Led in Arabic, Ramli, and by the way, Led is very close to the international Israeli airport, Ben Gurion Airport, which is named after the founder of Israel, David Ben Gurion. Jaffa, again, which is essentially now part of Tel Aviv municipality, but it was much bigger, much more important than Tel Aviv for so many years. And Haifa and Akka. Akka is called it's acre in English historically, and in Hebrew would be referenced to as Akko. I use the Arabic words, because there's also, in addition to our displacement, there was an intentional plan, and which continues to de-Palestinize and de-Arabize the space, making it, Judaize it, add a Jewish, most times biblical names to indigenous Palestinian places, including towns and cities and natural reserves and so on. So I hope when you watch the news, you look at the historical context, which is always absent from this conversation and discussion. In those towns, the small minority of Palestinians who were able to survive the war in 1948 and remained in a miracle in those places, in those mixed cities, they became a minority within, just like the rest of the Palestinian society inside Israel after 48, remained a minority within their homeland. And overnight, Palestinians from a majority of the population became a minority inside Israel, or in their homeland in general, because of the dispossession and because of the 750,000 Palestinians in 1948 who were pushed out of historic Palestine. And from 1948 to 1966, Palestinians who remained inside Israel and became formally Israeli citizens, but never really obtained a full equal status as citizens, because Israel was created as a Jewish state. It was created as a state. In fact, and if you look at the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, it says that this is a state for a Jewish people. And what makes it different than many other countries around the world, in fact, most countries around the world, if maybe the only country in the world, is that it's a country that is defining its citizenship and nationality, not based on the people who are living in that territory necessarily, but based on the religion of the people who, some of them live in that territory, but some of them may have not even heard of that country or may not have any connections or interest in being part of that country. And in fact, under the law of return that Israel passed shortly after Israel was established, it makes it very clear that any Jew, any Jewish person, anywhere in the world, including in India, and there were small but important Jewish Indian community, have the right to immigrate to Israel, and by stepping foot in the country at the airport, they obtain automatically an Israeli citizenship. They become Israeli citizens, no questions asked, with some exceptions around criminal convictions and if they had any issues, or issues about whether they are really Jewish people. And that has been a controversy. The controversy was not about whether the Jewish people have the right to immigrate and to settle in Palestine and to obtain Israeli citizenship, but the controversy inside Israel was always about who is a Jew, who decides who is a Jew. And there is obviously halakha or a religious teaching or particular religious instructions. And there's a divisions within the Jewish community between the Orthodox school of thought and the reformist and the conservatives and others about who is eligible to be a Jew. And in the fact that was the controversy, rather than whether there is any such right that could be given under international law for anyone to be claiming status of a settler by virtue of religion to come to a place that had no connection in modern times, in recent modern history, other than saying that in 2,000, 3,000 years ago, Jewish people had their own connection to the land, at least some of the people who had made that connection. And Zionism really was about that, creating this project of how to help defend and protect Jewish people from, particularly in Europe and Eastern Europe, from pogroms, from anti-Semitism, from attacks against them. There was horrific attacks, particularly by Europeans. How the Zionism and Zionist founders wanted to look for a solution that would change the status of the Jewish people from a persecuted religious minority, cultural minority, into a nation that will be able to have the same attributes of other national communities and national groups, and also build its own place that will be able to protect and defend themselves. And Zionism was keen to make it clear that there's no other place for Jewish people other than that Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. Making the connections to the biblical origins, even though Zionist founders were secular, they were not really religious, but they knew that the most powerful point or argument that could be made about making the case for why Jewish people from all over the world can make the claim over Palestine is by asserting that we have been living there, we had ties as a people to the land 2,000, 3,000 years ago, and we are reclaiming that right, and we are going to exercise our right to establish a national homeland in Palestine. And they were successful. They were successful because they were able to take advantage of a number of international events. Some of those events were one of the worst events that happened to humanity. But one thing that I think is important to keep in mind is that Zionism and the Zionist founder always thought about themselves as settlers. They had looked at settler colonialism, they had copied and taken those kinds of plans, and they thought that that would be the way that they would be able to do it in Palestine. And they were successful also in lobbying senior members of the British government. And in fact, you have the foreign minister of Britain, Balfour, giving the so-called the Balfour Declaration, which essentially said, we as a British empire, and we will promise you, we will give the promise to create a national homeland in Palestine, right? Denying and negating the rights of the indigenous Palestinian community that have already been established, was clear identity, clear connection to historically to the land. And so there was Balfour, who was, by the way, and you can look at some articles and some scholarship that were written, himself an anti-Semitic. There was a kind of a conversion between those who were anti-Semitic, those who did not want to see Jews assimilate and be part of Europe and be part of other parts of the world, and those Zionists who thought that that would be the best interest of Jews to take Jewish people from Europe, take them from other communities where they were living for centuries, and bring them to one place. And sometimes they were also discussing other options, not just Palestine. At one point, they even discussed Uganda, as in fact, Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism, had also considered the possibility of creating a national homeland for Jewish people in Uganda, in Africa. There were some other suggestions that were made, but ultimately they ended up with Palestine as the location. And then the reason I'm going into the historic background is to emphasize, because also many of you have probably studied so well your own history with colonialism, with British Empire and the oppression that have taken place in India and other places, and the way that your ancestors were able to reject this kind of oppressive regime and colonialism for something that would be that would give liberation, that would give freedom to people, that would make it and end that sort of domination as part of colonialism. And I know that there's still a lot of serious problems and human rights violations that are happening in India with caste system, with the Dalit, with issues that very difficult things that related to the partition that happened with Pakistan, things that are happening in Kashmir, and all of these issues that are really, really important to continue to struggle for people's rights and freedom. But I think there is really a common thread here, that is settler colonialism had impacted the Palestinian lives, changed their lives a century ago or more, and it continues to do that to this day, but it's doing it now in a different form. Israel was created in 1948. This Zionist project of creating the state of Israel was successful in destroying over 415 Palestinian towns and villages, displacing 750,000 Palestinians in 1948. Now, all of these people who we say, where are they now? Most of these refugees continue to live outside Palestine, particularly in neighboring Arab countries, in Lebanon in particular, Syria, Jordan, some of them even in Egypt. But there is also a bigger Palestinian diaspora now, because many Palestinians have left Palestine, or different parts of Palestine, whether it's what we call Palestine 48, the land that became part of the state of Israel, or the West Bank and Gaza that were occupied by Israel in 1967, and including Jerusalem, by the way. East Jerusalem was occupied in 1967. West Jerusalem was occupied during the 1948 war. And so here we are in the middle of Ramadan, in the middle of a heightened tension around issues of access to religious sites, displacement or potential threats displace Palestinian community in Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem, which is an occupied territory. Yet Israel doesn't consider it an occupied territory. It annexed it in 1967 to West Jerusalem, and it says and continues to claim, I think it stands alone in the world as the only country that recognizes that East Jerusalem is part of the state of Israel, as far as jurisdiction, as far as the fact that it is not an occupied territory under international law. So what is happening now, what happened in the last week or so, is a culmination. It's years and years of Israel continuing to assert its power as a military occupying power in the West Bank and Gaza, as well as a ethno-national state with leaders like Benjamin Netanyahu, but many others who shifted so much to the right, that to the extent that people who were in the fringe of the Israeli society as right-wing extremists, like the new member of the Knesset, Ben Gvir, who is now one of those vocal voices intimidating and assaulting the rights of Palestinians in East Jerusalem. All of these fringe right-wingers who were 20 years ago were seen as Kahanists because they belonged to or believed and supported the Rabbi Meir Kahana, who was infamous for his racism, for championing the destruction and deportation and transfer of Palestinians from their homeland. There are those who remained from the West Bank and Gaza, and even encouraging Palestinian citizens like myself and my families to leave Israel. And Meir Kahane was elected in the early 1980s to the Israeli parliament and then disqualified from running. His movement became declared illegal. He was assassinated or killed here in New York, and yet his followers continue to grow. And you see that invoking the name Kahane is invoking like a major KKK. It's like a white nationalist, racist leader that now his followers, those who were brought up on his, are main politicians that are stoking racism, and they are intimidating and abusing or making sure that the Israeli government, the one that, especially now that we're talking about Israeli government, new one forming, will continue to expand its policy of annexation, annexing not just East Jerusalem, but the whole West Bank to Israel. In fact, there is already de facto annexation happening in the West Bank. And yet the international community is looking at it as if, oh, no, we have to stop settlements. The settlements are continuing and continued unabated for decades. And this was not just a Benjamin Netanyahu issue or policy. This was a policy of all Israeli governments, from the Labor Party that seems to be given some kind of a pass in the international community, as if they were the ones that are open to peace and the ones that were really willing to compromise with the Palestinians. No, the Labor Party, the Israeli Labor Party, which was really the founding party of the State of Israel. David Ben-Gurion was the head of the first of that party, but different name in Mapai at the time. They were the ones who are the architect of the settler colonialism, and which translating it from settler colonial Zionist movement into institutions, into government agencies, into a state apparatus that made sure that Palestinians are being displaced en masse, that Palestinians do not get access to political power, that they do not have any economic power, they're not able to exercise any meaningful self-determination, whether within the State of Israel or in the West Bank and Gaza. And successive Israeli government have endorsed and fully implemented plans to settle Israeli settlers in occupied territory. That is what you are more familiar of hearing. You're hearing about Israeli illegal settlements in the West Bank in particular, and East Jerusalem included. And yet, over the years, this was a policy of all different Israeli government actors, and not just Benjamin Netanyahu, who has been in power for over 11 years now. And so when we talk about what is happening to Palestinians and why they are resisting in the way that they are resisting, it is not just a matter of, oh, one recent escalation that happened in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where Israel have instigated and provoked the worshippers who were attacked by stun grenades, tear gas, and some even use of rubber bullets, attacked even journalists who were covering the violent raid by Israeli security forces into Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is in East Jerusalem. It's part of the old city of Jerusalem and is considered part of an occupied territory. And yet again, Israel treats it as part of its part of its state, and yet the situation in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, this is the other part that is in the news, represents another example of ethnic cleansing, because the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, by the way, this is a neighborhood where I visited when I was a teenager boy. My parents were not, my dad was a nurse, my mom was a teacher. We couldn't afford, going to hotels, or, at that time in the 80s, we were not even able to think about going abroad for trips. And so what we would do every summer, we would go to Nablus or Ramallah or Jerusalem and stay in, kind of guest houses, very affordable, kind of like the Airbnb of today. And we stayed in Sheikh Jarrah for a number of summers. And I remember it's one of the most beautiful neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. but it's also very strategic, and it had one of the most Palestinian institutions in that part of the region of Jerusalem and the West Bank. In fact, the offices of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, were based in very close to Sheikh Jarrah, and those were closed as a result of Israeli government making sure that Palestinians' leadership and political leadership does not exist in East Jerusalem. That's why you don't see really any people on the news from East Jerusalem saying we are the representative of the PLO. They hardly exist because Israel made sure that they are stripped of their citizenship or residency. They are pushed out, or their offices or apparatus is closed. They did the same thing to, by the way, NGOs that are affiliated, sometimes artistic institutions like Al-Hakawati Theater. They have made sure that instead there are settlers and Israeli Jewish. Most of them would be either religious or Zionist, traditionally Zionist nationalist, that would come and settle and take over as much property as possible. And they orchestrated and they crafted a way to do that, so that would not look like the Israeli government directly is going to evacuate and forcefully evict and displace Palestinians who live in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. They came up with a legal way of doing that with the assistance of private associations. And some of them are nonprofit organizations that actually have a special, they are registered in the US or have been given support from US through taxpayer donations and so forth, which are tax deductible in the United States. And they were able to use two laws that were enacted. First law was the Absentee Property Law that was enacted in the early 1950s, I think in 1953, and another law, Israel Administrative Law in 1970, I believe, to make the claim that Jewish people who have lived in some of those properties before 1948 have the right to claim their property. And that's why you hear in the news, it's about a real estate dispute. It's not about eviction. It's about people who are claiming some real estate that belonged to their ancestors, and now they are doing that using legal tools. And we know that for decades, Israeli legal system was not neutral, was never impartial, was always part and parcel, particularly in the context of housing and land confiscation. And particularly when it comes to national security interest, it was part of providing legitimacy to Israeli policies and giving them the rubber stamp of judicial legitimacy by approving so many policies, whether within the state of Israel, for confiscation of lands of Palestinian citizens like my family and thousands of other Palestinian families, as well as settler colonial policies in the West Bank of taking private Palestinian land in different kinds of regimes. For example, using the emergency regimes. I'm sure you're familiar with that because I think Britain used that as well in India, using the emergency laws in order to declare certain areas as closed military areas or used for the public interest. And the public interest would not be other than Jewish use only, or declaring certain areas close to the border as areas that are national security threat, closing it, knowing that they belong mostly to Palestinians. And that's happened a lot in the Galilee, by the way. Even though there was real, genuine national security interest, allowed the taking of and confiscation of an appropriation of Palestinian land, transferring them into Israeli institutions, particularly the Land Administration Authority, that has now control over 90% of land in Israel. So the land in Israel is very centralized, and it was a process that started in 1948. In fact, it started pre-1948, but as the state was created, there were institutions that took over that role that was started really with Zionist organizations like the Jewish Agency or like the Jewish National Fund, that have operated, actually registered as a British associations or charities, and started to work pre-1948 in order to help settle Jewish people in the land of Palestine. And those things continue to this day. I can't tell you how many national parks where trees are kind of planted with people all over the world can donate to the Jewish National Fund, and the Jewish National Fund will plant a tree in memory of your loved one. And that park was established on the ruins of Palestinian villages and towns all over the country, from the south, from the Naqab, all the way to the Galilee, to the Upper Galilee. How many times there are settlements, Israeli settlements that were created for Jewish residents or citizens only. Israel allowed and facilitated that taking, most recently by the admission committee law, which basically allowed certain Jewish communities to have admission committees to decide who is eligible to be part of the community, to join the community by, for example, giving them a parcel of land to build a house. And these admission committees were this law that was enacted a few years ago was direct a challenge or a bypass of a Supreme Court decision that was made in 2000, got a lot of international attention, and a lot of praise as a landmark decision called the Qa'dan decision, related to a Palestinian couple, citizens of Israel, who wanted to buy a parcel of land in the Jewish settlement of Katsir, which is in the center of Israel. It's a very small village. They wanted to have a quality of life. They thought that they would have better quality of life because their town, Baq al-Gharbi, had no real, they were not given a permit to build their own housing. Their land were confiscated. They didn't have the infrastructure for a city or town. They wanted a better education, even though they made the big compromise of moving into predominantly Jewish town. But they said, well, we are citizens just like everybody else. We have the right to settle or to live anywhere we want. They applied, submitted an application, and they were denied. And this settlement, the Katsir settlement, was one of many, I think dozens, if not hundreds, of Israeli settlements that were created by the Jewish agency in order to settle and to expand the settlement of Jewish immigrants in different parts of the country, including sometimes there was a alignment between those policies and those practices and the Israeli government policy of what they call Jewidization of the Galilee and the Naqab. And Jewidization of, that is the term that is used, Yehuda Galil Negev. And there was even a promise that was made by a former President George W. Bush to the former Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, I believe in 2004 or 2005, with a letter that is the American government understands and supports the encouragement, I am paraphrasing here, the Judization of the Galilee and the Negev. What that basically means is that you are siding with one group over the other. You are taking a stand, you are assisting the state in its continuing engineering of demographics, in denying people equal access to their land, to housing, and ability to really create a place where all people be treated equally. Now, so the US government has never been neutral, has always been backing the state of Israel almost from day one. It only became more involved after the 1967 war, when it realized the strategic importance of Israel as a state that were able to quash and to defeat Arab militaries during the 1967 war, with the euphoria around in 6 days, Israel multiplied its size by occupying the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. And this is from there, you would see that how US government had become more and more involved in maintaining the strategic status of Israel as an ally. And therefore, it was not just a matter of, whoa, Israel is such a great democracy, and we have a shared values with the United States, and therefore we support it as the only democracy in the Middle East. It was more about the strategic, military strategic, and economic, I would say, value of Israel as an entity that would be able to provide the United States with all sorts of services. So it is a mutual, very good mutual deal. Now, that obviously has to come on the cost of some, and that came on the cost of the Palestinian people. And therefore, all the talk about peace negotiations, and definitely the Oslo Accords that were signed in 1993, which promised in 5 years there will be a Palestinian state alongside Israel, had nothing to do with real realization of the Palestinian self-determination, but rather, and that is something that is now even some liberal Zionists, some people who live in Israel or outside, who are committed to the state of Israel, agree with that analysis, that Oslo was nothing but another way of gaining and perpetuating Israeli control over entire Palestine, historic Palestine, by maintaining some sort of dependence on Israel, by making sure that any Palestinian entity would not rise to a power or a viable state that will be able to prevent the domination of Israel over the historic Palestine. And that is exactly what the Zionist founders really believed. Even though they agreed to the partition plan that was presented to the United Nations General Assembly and adopted in 1947, David Ben-Gurion and others said, and this is documented in the memoirs and in historians that looked at documents from that era, that they said, we would agree to the partition plan reluctantly because we are not going to concede that the Jewish people shouldn't have full access and full control over Eretz Israel, historic homeland, which covers even for some Jewish Israel, for some Zionist organizations, it actually went beyond historic Palestine to cross to Transjordan and even beyond. So there was a compromise that was made, knowing that it was good to start with something and knowing that there would be under a disadvantage, because if you look at the demographics of the partition plan of 1947 that was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly, which was rejected by the Palestinians because it was clear injustice, because it was clear that it will deprive the Palestinian majority the ability to exercise the right to self-determination, where 40% of the people who would be living in the Jewish state that would be created under the partition plan were Palestinians. And the Zionist leaders at the time understood that that would be a major problem. They will not be able to have a pure Jewish state, Zionist state, with the way that and therefore the war that started in 1948 was an attempt to change that reality, to push as many Palestinians outside those areas and to create a state of Israel that has maximum amount of Israeli Jewish people, where became Israeli citizens, but really maximum amount of Jewish Zionist settlers, and minimum amount of Palestinian indigenous communities that would remain in that state. And they succeeded in doing that in 1948, and it continued to do that constantly. It never stopped. It only changed some of the tactics that were changed. It shifted from 1948 to 66. We're focusing on what was happening within the new state that was created. Israel put the Palestinian citizens of Israel, the tiny minority of 170,000 people. Now there were over 1.5 million Palestinians who live inside Israel, 20% of Israel's population. In between 1948 and 66, they were placed under martial law, under military law that allowed deprivation of liberties, from freedom of movement, confiscation of lands. That was really a key issue. Even cracking down on political associations and speech, all kinds of things in order to controlling the education system. To this day, you see the impact on how Palestinians don't know their history, their poets, their national symbols, etc. And that shifted in 1966 to after the war in '67 to the West Bank and Gaza, and also to the Golan Heights, where the Golan Heights is now not even mentioned at all, where there's also a settler colonialism that has continue, and now they have wine industry, for example, in Golan Heights. That's a occupied territory where Israel has maintained, and because of the war in Syria, no one really cares about what happens to that part, because obviously the more important thing is the civil war in Syria. Now back to Palestine, I think where we are in a moment today of seeing people from all over Palestine, historic Palestine. And again, when I'm using the words, Israel is a political entity. For Palestinians, it is a political entity that come to realize and to implement the settler colonial project, that also have used apartheid and segregation and separation and domination of one group, that is Jewish Israelis, over non-Jews, and particularly Palestinians. Now, the reference to Palestine could be sometimes used in different ways. There's more commonly now used to say Palestine is in the West Bank and Gaza, because that's where, for example, where the Palestinian Authority that was created under the Oslo Agreement has some authority in the major cities, from Ramallah to Karim, Beit Lahem, and to obviously Gaza, which is now controlled by the Hamas faction. Now, but for Palestinians, when they say Palestine, it's really historic Palestine. It's about the idea that they remain connected to this land, to its history, to its memories, to their ancestors, to the way that they were subjugated to by the different policies of the Zionist movement. And they are obviously and important to make it clear so that will not be confusing. So when I say Israel, it is Israel, what is now the state that was created without definite borders, by the way. Israel has never agreed to define its borders, because the ceasefire agreement in 1949, in Rhodos, in the Greek island of Rhodos, where they were signed the agreement, and where drew the green line of because they used a green pen to draw the line of the ceasefire between Jordan and other Arab armies and the state of Israel. The Palestinians had almost no say in that. They never been really considered as a part of a lot of the processes that happened. In fact, if you look at even the UN resolutions that were passed after the war in 1967, they related to the Palestinians as some humanitarian refugee problem, not as a national liberation movement. The PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, that had to assert itself and to create a change in the way that people would think about what is happening in Palestine and in Israel, and say that, well, there is a serious historic injustice that happened and never really been addressed. And now most of the people who have, most, let's say, governments, including I think the Indian government, would tell you that we support the two-state solution. That is a state of Israel that has 80% control over the historic Palestine, and less than 20%, at best scenarios, 20% of historic Palestine that will be given to the Palestinians for their state. That is the so-called the Oslo Accords framework of creating a two states side by side with peace and security, blah, 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 all of that stuff. And yet, if you know what the reality on the ground is, if you ever visit, you don't even have to visit. Today with our technologies, you can just really virtually understand what is happening there by seeing that Israel controls the whole land, from the river, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, that's why when you hear from the river to the sea, that is the reference to historic Palestine, and where Israel is now the sovereign. It is a sovereign as a state that was created in 1948 in the 80% of the land, and then it's an occupying sovereign power in West Bank, East Jerusalem, and also in Gaza, even though Israel evacuated its settlements from the Gaza Strip in 2005 under a plan called the disengagement plan that took all their civilian settlers who were living there, and there were not too many of them. There were, I think, 1,000, but less than 20,000, I believe. And with the military installations, and rearranged or reorganized its deployment around the Gaza Strip, but maintained full control of the Gaza Strip. Israel controls access to Gaza by land, by sea, and by air. There's the airport, the only airport in Gaza that was created after 1993 under the Oslo Agreements, was bombed and completely destroyed by Israel during the second Intifada after 2000. And so the Gaza Strip is still under Israel's domination, even though it is not the same way as it controls Palestinian towns and cities with land troops, ground troops. That's why you see airstrikes in Gaza, not ground troops going into different locations to combat with Palestinian armed groups, right? And so all of this tells you that we are in a reality where Israel is controlling the whole Palestinian territory that was historically Palestine, and now you have a system of privileges and rights given to Jewish Israelis, including if you are settling in the West Bank, you have more rights than the indigenous Palestinians at all levels. Israeli law is increasingly applicable and apply in different Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And Israel wants to expand that so that they will erase any chance that the Palestinians will ever have any chance of even have this very small, tiny state that would be living under 20% of the land. So with that, I want to open it to questions. I know I took a lot of time to go over, but I think there was a lot to cover in the history and bringing it to where we are today. I hope you can be any questions. I wasn't able to follow the chat, but I see there were a lot of things posted. So Kranti, I'd love your help in any questions that you can help raise or highlight. And I thank you again for this opportunity.
Jamil, thank you so much. I think that was a crash course in the history of Palestine and quite a deep insight in what's happening now. Sneha has been consolidating the questions, and she will pose some of those questions to us. Sneha?
Yes. So, Jamil, we have a couple of questions that we have from the audience. The first question is, was the Oslo Accord a mistake?
Thank you. That's a great question. The Oslo Accords mistake was that it didn't really recognize first the inherent right of self-determination for the Palestinian people. The Oslo Accords only recognized the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, as the elected or the official representative of the Palestinian people. That's number one. Number two, it only talked directly and in the first phase of the accords that were signed, only about the Palestinians who were living in the West Bank and Gaza. In fact, the beginning of the implementation of the accords started with Israel pulling out, giving the Palestinians access to Gaza and Jericho in the West Bank. And it was called Gaza and Jericho first, because it kind of, that's when former Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat returned to Gaza, and he was only able to visit, to go in between Gaza city, in particularly Gaza city. He didn't even have the whole access to the whole Gaza Strip and to Jericho. And so it was really specifically focusing on the West Bank and Gaza. It delayed the negotiations around major key questions, fundamental key questions of refugees of 1948 and 1967, and their right of return, their right to have compensation as upheld by international resolutions and international law. Second, East Jerusalem, or Jerusalem as a whole, it was deferred as to later negotiations. Three, the issues of water and natural resources was seen as another thing that would be deferred. And essentially, it basically just created a process for of appearance of we are going to start negotiating peace, while at the same time not taking enough bold actions to stem the rise in Israel colonial settlements, particularly in the West Bank. In fact, if you go back to the numbers, and I don't have the numbers exactly here, between 1993 and 1995-96, this is the time when the Oslo Accords were signed in September 1993, and Prime Minister Rabin, who was the architect with Shimon Peres, both of them are dead now. One was killed by extremists in 1995, Rabin, which basically put an end to Oslo at the time. And Shimon Peres, who was even more sophisticated and more diplomatically influential, especially internationally, were the ones who basically said, we are going to, and they explained that. Rabin himself, I remember hearing him say that. He said, the reason that we're having this agreement is because we need to have we have to segregate from the Palestinians. We have to maintain our Jewish state. So the final thing that Oslo ignored, or particularly willingly ignored, was really dealing with in all 1948 Nakba, where is the catastrophe, the Palestinian catastrophe, and its consequences. So it had never attempted to deal with the status of Palestinian citizens of Israel. The same Palestinians who are now defending their houses and communities in the so-called mixed cities. And so the increased number of settlements in that period never stopped. So while they were saying we are for a process, they weren't even saying that there will be surely a Palestinian state. There was some language around of some creation of some entity, but then it was clear that within 5 years there should be some permanent Palestinian entity there. There was a rise in settlements building, and continuing to move more and more Israeli civilian settlers into the West Bank, particularly in East Jerusalem. Remember, in 1991, after the first Gulf War and the end of the Cold War, Israel had absorbed over 1 million of Russian or former Soviet Union Jewish community residents or citizens who immigrated to the state of Israel and were given automatic citizenship. Many of them will have to be settling, have to be given housing and building. So there was a boom in construction to make sure that those individuals are also settled. And in fact, where does that happen? It happened in a lot of areas around Jerusalem. For example, the city of Modi'in was one of the metropolitan, kind of really close to Ramallah and Jerusalem. So there was an expansion of settlements, both in East Jerusalem, but also in the West Bank. And there was also a lack of respect to international commitments and international law with regard to peace processes. There's a great book by a professor in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, actually. Her name is Christian Bell. Christine Bell wrote about peace accords making and compared them between South Africa and in Israel. And it's a fascinating research and scholarship, because she was able to show, and kind of compare what happened in the Oslo process and accords, and why they don't conform to international law, and what was the missing pieces in it, in order to provide transitional justice, in order to provide implementation of international human rights commitments, including the right to self-determination, which, as you know, is concluded in the key international human rights instruments, right? So all of these together really made Oslo Accords nothing but a security deal for Israel, whereas the Palestinian Authority would be created in order to be the security subcontractor to the state of Israel. And that's what we see now, where while there are other functions of the Palestinian Authority, but the main function that is really most critical one for Israel is the security apparatus. That is, the Palestinian Authority would take over the full control over the major cities in the West Bank, in the areas called Area A's under Oslo Accords, and there they will be able to control the Palestinian community, and that is a very tiny part of the West Bank. And they relied on the Palestinian Authority since the time that Arafat was in power to crack down on dissent, on criticism, on media freedom, on human rights defenders. In fact, they were torturing people in both in Gaza and West Bank detention facilities to this day. I mean, there's still serious crackdown, and we've seen even in the last wave where the Palestinian Authority was helping to facilitate the security of the state of Israel while Palestinian civilians were attacked and worshippers were attacked in Al-Aqsa Mosque. So all of this together made, and particularly after Rabin's assassination and the fact that we had a period between 1996 and 1999 where Netanyahu was first elected as a prime minister with a clear intention of stopping the Oslo Accords, because he was the main, at the beginning, he knew that there was a serious he knew that Oslo is flawed for the state of Israel because it gave the Palestinians some footstep, some control over Palestine, right? But he also knew how to take advantage of Oslo to keep it with the help of the United States, the European, the EU, even the United Nations, to maintain some sort of appearance that there's some peace process going on. And therefore, the two-state solution is the only viable option, while Israel from there went from bad to worse. So I think these are the main flaws, and that's why people now tell you Oslo is dead. There's no way that you can even think about a viable Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, because Israel has eliminated this option intentionally and created a reality on the ground and set facts on the ground that are clearly not going to be easy to change, particularly mass movement of Israeli civilian communities into an occupied territory, which under the Geneva Convention would be considered a war crime, would be grave violations of the international humanitarian law that prohibit the occupying power from forcibly moving civilian community and basically re-engineering the demographics of the territory. So basically the Oslo Accords became some sort of like a management company for the Israeli occupation. It kind of gave the Israelis the convenience of showing we are engaged in some peace talks, while at the same time they only maintained the domination and power over the Palestinian communities all over the West Bank, and certainly controlling the Gaza, as I said earlier.
Thank you so much. We have a lot of questions, but I'll try to consolidate them into 2 or 3 questions at a time. So the next question is, to what extent do you think the BDS movement was effective? And also there is a follow-up question, and that is it is a fact that about 20% of Israel's population is Arab. Will the BDS system not affect them negatively?
Great, thank you. These are really great questions. So the BDS movement, it's a movement. It's not a one organization. There is a coordinating committee that was created by hundreds of civil society Palestinian organizations in the West Bank and Gaza, and really created. It started in 2005. It was right after the International Court of Justice in a landmark judgment. Or advisory opinion rather, decided or made it clear that Israel wall that was being constructed on major parts of the occupied Palestinian land was illegal under international law. It reached really important conclusions as to the applicability of international humanitarian law and human rights law in the West Bank. It made it very clear that Israel is also, by constructing the wall, was negating and undermining the right to self-determination to the Palestinian people. Basically, with the first time there was, since the 1948 or 1947, with the time when we had a resolution on refugees and on issues of the partition plan, we have the first advisory opinion that affirmed what Palestinians knew, that what Israel was doing from 1993 up to 2004, when that judgment was advisory opinion was declared, was illegal, particularly in the context of the construction of the wall. And it has also implications on the status of the settlements. So in a reaction to that, there were Palestinian civil society organizations where we're looking at other ways to put pressure on Israel. It was clear that Israel was taking advantage of a number of international events. It took advantage of the terrorist attacks in 9/11 in 2000, showing that, and there was the fact, because this happened in 2001, when the second Intifada was already underway, it became more bloody, violent events happening in the West Bank. Israel had retaken or reoccupied in 2002 major cities and committed serious crimes, including war crimes and crimes against humanity in different parts of the West Bank. And so there was a call for some international solidarity, and modeled after the South African divestment boycott movement. The 2005 it was created, and the BDS movement is now, and I think it's still too early to say, well, was it fully effective or not. I think what we are seeing is the reaction of the State of Israel and the government of Israel, including in its lobbying in the United States, suggests that the BDS movement was effective. Because if it's not effective, why would you, as a government, create and create entire offices within the government, allocate millions and millions of dollars in combating this movement? If you're thinking that it is not doing something that is that is effective, why would you see over 25 states in the United States passing laws with encouragement of the State of Israel directly, which is unprecedented, by the way, of seeing a foreign government and officials bragging about the fact that they were successful in passing laws in other countries in the United States of limiting and restricting the right of people to engage in boycotts, which, as you know, under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution is protected free speech, and boycott activity is considered a constitutional right, one of the highest rights in our system. And so you wonder, why is it that they subjected some of the founders or the main activists of the BDS movement to restrictions, to investigations, to intimidation, to travel bans? Why would Israel place a travel denying entry to international organizations that said, well, we are supporting the Palestinian call for boycott, where they're not doing anything violating any laws of any other country? Why would they even pass laws in the State of Israel criminalizing in certain instances, particularly in the context of civil suit, that if you are in Israel, living in Israel, or even I don't have to live in Israel, actually, it's extraterritorial kind of jurisdiction. Israel passed a law to fight boycott by saying that if you call for a boycott and that boycott had some tangible impact, you could be sued civilly. They could file a lawsuit in Israeli court and be found liable, which obviously meant to deter people from inside Israel, but also outside Israel. And one New Zealand lord, if you know the musician, the famous musician in New Zealand, there were two activists in New Zealand who campaigned against Lord show or appearance in Israel. And she really pulled out of a concert that she was going to make. And there was a civil suit that was filed against those two activists who live all the way in New Zealand, who advocated for the cultural boycott and said Lord should not be performing in a state that is oppressing other people. So I think the BDS movement has created a discourse and a symbolic fight for many activists who wanted to express their solidarity. It is not likely to change. Economic decisions are made at the highest level, although there are some gains. You can go to the BDS movement the BNC website, and you can see some of the successes for some companies that were pulled out of the West Bank and settlements, or in Israel, or pressuring other entities, financial or otherwise. But more importantly, it allowed to change the debate and the discourse around the need for Israel to be held accountable. And if you look at what's happening in the United States, for the first time, you have members of Congress who are proposing a legislation that would not sanction Israel really, but can condition some foreign assistance to Israel with respect to human rights. Where you see a movement at the Human Rights Council with the creation of the database that is merely focused on the Israeli settlements and discouraging businesses from facilitating war crimes that are committed by the virtue of supporting settlements. This database was a huge headache for the state of Israel and even for the United States, and they had to pass a law, and even some of the resolutions that were passed in Congress specifically address that. So if you having all of this, and clearly there is something changing, and yet it is really the floor, not the ceiling. It's a very symbolic act of solidarity. Just like if you're expressing, and it's coming from Palestinian civil society. So it's coming from the people who are living in Palestine. Now, the other part of the question is about whether it would harm Palestinian citizens of Israel. Look, for Palestinian citizens of Israel, I can tell you, it's not easy to say boycott us, boycott, our ability to be able to live where we are, because they are really depend very much on Israel for everything. They don't have any kind of self-autonomy or any kind of economic power to be able to sustain. So it is very difficult for a lot of Palestinians, although some Palestinian political factions within the Palestinian community inside Israel have endorsed forms of boycott. They are calling on the international community. I think they say, you can see some of them calling for international protection, some of them calling for the United States to end military export to Israel and military support to Israel. So they are not necessarily using the same terms and same kind of, but they are definitely aware of their different unique situation. In fact, the BDS movement have also made it very clear that it's very difficult for Palestinian citizens of Israel to engage in boycott, because they would be essentially not being able to survive. I think the other thing important to talk about boycotts is not a individual boycott. It's really institutions and businesses that are complicit in grave violations of international human rights. And I think more than anything, what the BDS movement was able to do was to bring together the three parts of the Palestinian struggle together and translate them into symbolic way of solidarity, even if it's not going to be effective, as effective yet as we've seen in South Africa, where in South Africa, there was a different political climate internationally. There was a different political support and solidarity in the United States, particularly among churches and Jewish American community, part of Jewish American community, the progressive one, and among, more importantly, Black and Brown communities who have joined, some of them late, but have really made a difference in terms of shifting the power. And so we don't have the same international environment, although I think they're going to be more, we will see more and more. And so the three elements of the BDS movement that I talked about earlier that really symbolize this Palestinian struggle, the struggle of the Palestinian refugees and their denial of their right to return and to be able to belong and be back in Palestine. The second is ending the apartheid and the Israeli occupation of West Bank and Gaza that was created in 1967. And three, full equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel. These three components are the components that Israel intentionally tried over the years to fragment, to ensure that they are not on the agenda of the international community. They are not addressed. they are not legitimate demands, claiming, for example, that the right of return will mean destruction of the state of Israel. Well, it's clearly not the case, because Israel have and continue to bring people who have no connection to the state of Israel other than being Jewish to be able to come and settle in this land of Israel from the river to the sea, and has done that over decades. And there are still places for people, if they choose so, Palestinian refugees, if they choose to return, to be able to return and to settle. That doesn't mean that they will particularly, displace Israeli Jewish citizens who or others who are living in their homes, because a lot of homes, historic homes, remained there intact, and they were inhabited by mainly Israeli citizens who were Jewish immigrants and settlers. There is a way that all of this could be addressed when you fundamentally analyze and understand the root causes of this injustice in Palestine. And I would not say it's a conflict, because conflict suggests that there's two parties that have the same powers and have there's imbalance of power, and there's clearly one side that has the power and ability to maintain control over other people. And I think the only way that you can be coming out of this mess, and that's violence, the cycle of violence, is only by addressing these three components. Now, the BDS movement doesn't tell you whether they are for one-state solution, two-state solution, three-state solution. It is really setting just the rights of, and centering the rights of people who are mainly Palestinians. I would add that in addition to the boycott movement, I think we should be offering what is the political solution that would be viable one, not just for the Palestinians and addressing their historic injustice, but also for the Israeli Jewish community. And that is something that I think has to be more addressed, to show that it is not about destroying you and kicking you back to Europe, or this is not what it is about. If you are really clear about what we do, we have to be confronting Zionism, which is the real problem for the creation of displacement, mass displacement, dispossession of the Palestinians, and offering an alternative that is rooted in providing protection and defending the rights of all people, regardless of their nationality, religion, race, color, and gender, sexual orientation, what have you, in order to live with dignity. And there are different models. I think now people are thinking that what we are now is a situation of existential survival. There's not enough space, political space and ability, because of the power regionally and internationally, to change and shift the dynamics. Although I think that there will be hopefully seeing more and more awakening from within the Israeli Jewish communities within the state of Israel. That is going to happen when more and more of them will see that they are subject to serious threats. Some of them will be leaving the state of Israel, and there will be a very important role for Jewish progressive American community to be able, and we are seeing it right now, shifting the discourse and saying that we do not support what Israel is doing in our name. And we would protect people, and Jewish people particularly, against anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism should not be construed as denying people's ability to struggle against historic injustice, to deny this kind of reframing of anti-Semitism as if it is about denying the existence of the Palestinian people. If the Palestinian people say Zionism is a racist movement, that would be construed as anti-Semitism. So there's a movement and awakening within the Jewish progressive American community that will have a major role in shifting the discourse in the United States, and hopefully the political decision-making. So that would be creating the environment for the people in historic Palestine to be able to come. But it will take many, many years, because what is happening now, and the violence that's happening, and the attacks, some of those, not only settlers, but Palestinian citizens are more vulnerable, but make no mistake, there are also attacks on Jewish civilians, and those are serious issues and serious violations that we should not be ignoring. But But the fundamental question is not about who is suffering more as much as that how do you address the historic injustice in a way that will pertain a safe and just environment for all to be able to, and a really life-affirming alternatives, rather than resorting to language like self-defense that only perpetuates acts of violence and war crimes with impunity.
Thank you so much. So I have a small follow-up question. While responding to the previous question, you mentioned that there were certain laws that have been passed by the state that restricts, I'm sorry, one second. There are certain that restricts, I think, protests or, I'll just actually read out the question. Is Muhammad here? I think he had put up a question regarding this, that there are certain laws that were passed that restrict, I think, protesting. So have these laws been challenged?
Well, if you're talking about Palestinians in the West Bank,
not protest, but boycotting. It restricts boycott.
Oh, the boycott. Yes. Oh, so if you're talking about the laws that were passed in the United States, there have been challenges, legal challenges. In this case, I can actually speak on ACLU work, because the ACLU and many other organizations, but we really, ACLU has taken the lead in challenging at least 3 laws that were passed in 3 different states that have made it more difficult, added restrictions to the right to boycott. And those laws that we challenged basically said the state, anyone who is contracting with the state, any business, financial entity, whether it's a university that is receiving funds from the state, or a lecture for all kinds of activities, or just a simple medical contractor like a speech therapist who's receiving a contract or money and contracting with the state, has to certify that they would not boycott the state of Israel. These are what the laws were really about, right? So they couldn't think of a way, because they would wanted to frame it as it's not a direct assault and direct attack on free speech, because if you just passed a law that said any boycott of Israel of any kind is a violation of the is prohibited or criminalized, that would clearly be would be very unconstitutional in the very instance. However, what they came up with this formula of, well, the state has its own authority and has its own privileges to decide who it wants to contract with, and they have the right as a state, and under a U.S. constitutional First Amendment law, the state has its own right to engage in free speech, as long as they don't do it in a biased way, as long as they don't do it in a restrictive way that would limit the free speech of other entities, right? So they said, well, we are taking that advantage, and we are going to limit and be the people who we want to contract with have to certify that they would not boycott Israel. And there was a case in Arkansas where even a newspaper was denied advertisement because newspapers today, particularly print media, this is the main source of income. They rely on ads, and if they were getting ads from the government, they had to certify that would not boycott Israel. So the editor of this Arkansas Times actually have said, well, I have no business with boycotting Israel. I have no position. I'm not active in the BDS movement. I'm not there. Why are you punishing me for and denying me access to these ads that are, basically would be paid ads by the government of Arkansas? And that is one of the cases that the ACLU won. As a result of these legal victories, some of the state legislatures are changing their laws in order to make it like, okay, the amount of money that would be contract. So you can't have just a $5, $100, or $1,000 honorarium for a lecture at the university to request certification. It has to be like they increased the amount of money that would be covered by these laws, but they're still very problematic. There's a continuing advocacy against those laws, which I hope that will at some point be addressed by the Supreme Court, even though it's a very conservative court. But I think on First Amendment issues, they could be a little more open to these arguments that denying the right or restricting the right to boycott would be blatantly unconstitutional. The other issue that is attached, is being more prevalent now, is states at the state level, because the law, by the way, to restrict boycott Israel at the federal level was defeated, or did not proceed, did not advance. So one of the things that are happening now, they are trying to frame also anti-Semitism as something that would be criminalizing activity of support to Palestinian boycott, or any expression of support for Palestinian liberation, or all the things that, and that is something that really becoming a problem. Florida passed a law that adopted the new definition of anti-Semitism that basically says, if you are calling for the boycott of Israel and not boycotting any other country, you are singling out Israel, and you are that it would be anti-Semitism, because there's a double standard against Israel. If you said, and the same law that was passed, if you said that Israel is a racist endeavor, that would also amount to anti-Semitism. If you say that, if you call for, so there's these examples that were adopted, which really don't fight the real anti-Semitism and the horrible violence that we've seen particularly during the beginning of the Trump administration, and it's continuing. There are really limiting free speech when it comes to Israel, and it's sort of using the anti-BDS laws, as well as reframing what anti-Semitism is, in order to chill speech critical of Israel, activism, particularly on college campuses, among different organizations. The previous administration, the Trump administration, and Mike Pompeo was Secretary of State, threatened even to classify Human Rights Watch as an anti-Semitic organization. I believe the other organization was Oxfam, for their advocacy for human rights in of Palestinian rights. It's really have come to a point where some states, like in Texas, there was a case that got a lot of media attention. Hurricane relief funds were restricted, or were denied, or were conditioned upon certification that the hurricane survivors would be pledging not to boycott the state of Israel. Obviously, that immediately was overturned because it was scandalous, that sort of. But it is for many people in the United States, even if they don't have any position or not involved in advocacy and solidarity with Palestinians, they see it as a worrisome. Even Jewish American organizations, mainly the progressive ones, are telling the Biden administration, do not enforce this new definition of anti-Semitism. It's harmful to free speech. It doesn't serve us. It doesn't help us. It only actually makes things worse, because there's diverting attention from the real anti-Semitism, the horrible hate crimes that are perpetrated against Jewish people, synagogues, cemeteries, etc., from the real and that diversion of resources and attention is not helpful, and it's not going to make us safer. That's what Jewish American community are saying increasingly in past several years.
Thank you so much. Colin sir, do you have any questions that you would like to ask? You're muted.
Fazal also.
Yes, and Fazal, our colleague, he has a question.
I wanted to ask two questions. One is, what is your assessment of Hamas today? And second is, there was an organization in America that we had some connection with, called the Public Defender's Office. How is that doing? What's your assessment of that?
I'm not aware of the Public Defender's Office. You mean you mean the Public Defender's legal aid office, or?
It's like a legal aid office for persons who are, let's say, jailed and so on. It's a free legal aid office, but it was called the Public Defender's Office.
Where is it based? Do you know?
No, I don't. It had a person there called Kenneth Mann, who was its director for.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. I know what you mean. Okay, yes. The Public Defender's Office, which was founded by Kenneth Mann, is still there. It provides legal aid to Israeli people who are brought into the Israeli legal system, the civilian legal system, and cannot afford a lawyer. It is still doing its work, but it has been under-resourced. They've been doing a lot of monitoring of prisons and jails, detention facilities, but they have been also very limited in the way that they are able to impact policies and legislation that relates particularly to political prisoners, Palestinian political prisoners. As you know, there are thousands of Palestinians who are jailed and sentenced in Israel for political crimes, that is in the context of the hostilities or the occupation that were sentenced to serious, hundreds of them to long sentences. So the Public Defender Office is still there, but I don't think that it's as effective in responding to representing Palestinian detainees. I know that in Haifa, in my hometown, and in other towns where Palestinian demonstrators, protesters, and others are, whenever that happens, there's usually volunteers, a kind of pro bono Palestinian bar that is organized to defend them because they think that that's more effective rather than depending on the legal aid office.
Right. And you can put us in touch with Palestinian legal organizations that are fighting on behalf of Palestinians. You can put us in touch with them, please.
Yes, absolutely. There are many of them from the Gaza, particularly I would name El Mizan and the Palestinian Center for Human Rights. One of the two, Palestinian Center for Human Rights, one of the longest, I think, Palestinian, the Gaza-based organization, very active. You can check their work. It has become more difficult for them more recently because of the restrictions on travel, ability to invite people to come and monitoring. In fact, Gaza Strip is closed to international reporters right now. Only the reporters who were in Gaza before the beginning of the recent wave of attacks are allowed to report on Gaza. I just saw on Twitter that reporters who want to go in, they're not allowed to go in. So there are only allowed to report on Gaza from inside Israel. So they're basically not able to, directly visit the sites that are being attacked. They're not able to visit and interview Palestinians on the ground, and so on. The other Palestinian organization that I would recommend in the West Bank are Al-Haq, which is one of the oldest, in fact, the oldest Palestinian human rights organization. It's based in Ramallah, and they have been working really incredibly in monitoring, documenting, and pursuing accountability, particularly before the International Criminal Court. As you know, there is a pending investigation that's called the Palestine situation, because the Palestinian Authority, as its status at the United Nations and the General Assembly was recognized as an observer member state, was able to join the Rome Statute, the ICC, and referred the cases, or asked to open investigation into the 2014 war on Gaza, the attacks on civilians and war crimes and crimes against humanity, but also the ICC prosecutor now is looking into other violations of the laws of war and the Rome Statute, particularly possibly the settlement policy, the settlement enterprise as a violations of the Rome Statute, which is covered by the jurisdiction of the court. And obviously Israel has resisted that, and it used the help of the Trump administration to put sanctions on the ICC and the prosecutor, which fortunately were lifted by the Biden administration. So Al-Haq and many other Palestinian organizations have been instrumental in pushing for accountability and moving and bringing some deterrence, even if it's not something that investigation will take a long time. I don't think that we'll see anyone in the dock in The Hague anytime soon from the Israeli side. But it's also, well, remember that the ICC investigation is not just against Israeli personal responsibility of Israeli officials, whether civilian or military officials, who committed violations of the Rome Statute. covered by the jurisdiction, but it also covers armed groups. And that's, just go to your other question about Hamas. Hamas is dominating and controlling the Gaza Strip, has done that since the 2007, the takeover, after the international community, particularly the United States and Israel, decided not to recognize the Palestinian elections in the Legislative Council. And it's been recognized as a terrorist organization by both the US and Israel, first Israel and then the United States. It has a political arm. It also has an armed apparatus that is now being part of the hostilities. They have capabilities that I think are even surprising Israeli security officials in their ability to reach Israeli towns, both in the Tel Aviv area and in Jerusalem. It seems that they are also having they have had a lot of pressure from Palestinian communities around issues of, what is the strategy? How does, even under the Hamas control, what is this long-term strategy for liberation, for realization of Palestinian rights? And as any political entity and faction, Hamas was flexible in changing and evolving over the years. They had used brokers from mainly the Arab world, Qatar in particular, in order to get some assistance in order to survive under the Israeli blockade, which is really in itself an inhumane collective punishment. I mean, the reality on the ground is that it's hard really to tell, and I'm not in my position where I am. It's really hard to tell, what is for the Palestinians, how for the Palestinians to conduct their struggle for liberation and for freedom. I do know, as international human rights lawyer, that armed groups have responsibilities and obligations under international humanitarian law. And one hopes that when they conduct their hostilities and engage in hostilities with the state and respond to Israeli attacks, they do that while also respecting international humanitarian law. Unfortunately, the reality is that there is asymmetry between the Israel, which has a huge political, military, economic power. I think the seventh or eighth most powerful military in the world, and certainly the most powerful military in the Middle East, as opposed to an armed group that is under siege and blockade in Gaza, that doesn't have any way of obtaining any of the technological weaponry that Israel has in terms of the surgical. And yet we see what the outcomes are. You see Israel that says, with all its surgical attacks and invoking the right to self-defense, is causing so much civilian harm, both to civilian lives, including at least 38 children as of now been killed by those attacks just in the last 4 or 5 days, and many who have been displaced. Entire buildings were collapsed, including today the tower, the building, civilian building that was housing the Al Jazeera and AP media organizations, lawyers, and doctors' offices. They got a warning to evacuate, but yet still that raises serious concerns under international humanitarian law as to whether you can really target a building like this as a civilian object and turn it into a military object. And so the asymmetry between the Israel and the Palestinian armed groups has always been a problem, has always an issue for the Palestinians to be able to wage a reaction and defend themselves without violating the laws of war. I mean, we've seen how it's easy to name any kind of struggle or any kind of resistance, any kind of dissident as terrorists, right? That's particularly after 9/11. It's become kind of a way for many governments all over the world to do that. And I think in the Palestinian context, it's really clear that the Palestinian groups were committed to the national liberation. It's not about, and all the associations that they made between Hamas and ISIS and all other things, I think it's really a propaganda, to be honest. If you really study the history of Hamas and how it was created as a really an alternative to the national liberation movement led by the PLO. You can see that Israel is even facilitated the Muslim Brotherhood ability to create organizations and social organizations that would be countering the secular, more secular Fatah, PFLP, and other Palestinian factions that were more organized under the PLO, and yet and reached the conclusion that they needed to recognize the PLO, as we talked earlier, as part of the Oslo Accords, in order to stem the rise in the support for Hamas and other militant and more committed to religious movements, in order to use then this fragmentation and in order to continue to control the Palestinian territory, in order to control the Palestinian civilian population, and using collective punishment, using all kinds of ways to spread this really horror and terror that is happening here. What you see here is not a self-defense, as Biden and his Secretary of State have said. It is really an egregious violation of international law. There's no way that you can justify killing of children, attacking civilian in most densely populated areas. Remember, Palestinians in Gaza don't have shelters, don't have effective warning systems, don't even have the ability to go outside the Gaza Strip to flee as refugees if they wanted to avoid the violence, because they are under blockade and siege. It's a 13.8 square miles territory, the size of Detroit, and there is nowhere to escape the violence, literally. And in past attacks on Gaza, we saw how Israel even attacked UN facilities, schools, and other, even though they knew that there were civilians there. Now you can see that many people who are displaced from their buildings, from their houses, are being housed in UNRWA schools that are run by the UN refugee agency that dedicated to Palestinian refugees. And I'm really concerned that they will be again be doing the same problems that we had, or seen the horrific crimes that we've seen in the past, where civilians were targeted, and then Israel would say it's either a mistake or they're collateral damage, or Hamas has taken advantage of a civilian population in order to, and use them as a human shield in order to attack Israel. Well, you knew all of this from the get-go. There's nothing new there. The question of whether you really, as a state that protects, that really values life, or an international, or respect international law, would you do that even knowing that there will be civilians attacked? And so the adherence to international humanitarian law, while really important in this context, I think the political context, the larger political context, is more important in understanding the power relations between the factions and the armed groups in Gaza, and what's going on in Israel, and particularly the way that it really didn't start with Hamas firing missiles into Israel. It started, and it's important for everyone to understand this point, it started with Israeli escalation in attacks on worshippers in Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest religious site for Muslims. It started with stun grenades and tear gas thrown at worshippers. You have seen the videos. It started with limiting ability of Palestinians moving into the East Jerusalem. And it started also with the escalation of the threat of displacement in the Sheikh Jarrah community and neighborhood, which again has, as we discussed, direct relationship to ongoing ethnic cleansing policies in Jerusalem and in West Bank. So this was a reaction. And the unfortunate thing is that Israeli Jewish civilians have been harmed. I think there are at least 7 or 8 civilians have been killed. And the death toll is always going to be disproportionate. Palestinian lives always, particularly civilian lives, are always going to pay heavier price because of this situation of being under the control, under the domination of a country that has the power to be able to do it differently if we come to a conclusion that there is no military solution in Gaza. And it's only a matter of scoring political points at home. For Benjamin Netanyahu, it's very clear that this is a calculated attempt to escalate the situation in Jerusalem, knowing that there will be instigating a reaction from Hamas and other Palestinian groups. And he succeeded in doing that because he wanted to turn the attention from his failure to form a government and going into a new government with the right-wing factions, or to a new elections, and saving him the trial for charges. I mean, that's the irony, that instead of thinking that he is going to save himself the charges from war crimes that he committed over the years, we're talking about only saving himself from the charges of corruption, because that's the best that you can get Israeli accountability within the Israeli system. Israel doesn't have a system of accountability when it comes to war crimes. B'Tselem, the main premier Israeli human rights organization, have put research and documentation proving that Israel has not created a genuine, credible investigations of war crimes. And so what you have here, politicians taking advantage of a volatile situation, doubling down on using violence and escalation in order to protect themselves. This is one of the worst things that you could get, and it would only lead to further violence and further attack. And in some way or form, it really leads to what we're seeing now, the violence against Palestinians inside Israel, which has become even more threatening to the Israeli government than even the Gaza situation, because they understand that that is an internal threat. And that in of itself is worrying, because it kind of raises the level of mass atrocities to be committed against minority community, particularly Palestinians, or genocidal approaches that are getting more and more support within the Israeli society, and definitely by some politicians that were elected. And Benjamin Netanyahu is only one, representing one of many. And the alternative to Benjamin Netanyahu, to be clear, is not going to be another person who's going to be holding an olive branch to the Palestinians. It will be Benny Gantz. Who is Benny Gantz? He is the one who orchestrated the military attacks in 2014 when he was the chief of staff of the Israeli military. He is now the defense minister. It would be Bennett. It would be Bennett, who is a rising right-wing extremist who proudly said, I killed so many Arabs and I don't have a problem with that. So it is really concerned. That's why international pressure and accountability, and using all the forms that it's possible, from diplomacy to solidarity actions, so critical, including in India, where you have a government. Obviously, you have your own issues and problems to deal with, and no one is expecting you to do anything on Palestine, right? Do what you need to do in order to defend your people from COVID, from the attacks that the government is launching on you, civil society, and we've been following that, and we support you. But I'm saying that even in a country like India that had a history of supporting the Palestinian cause, and I know so many older generations of Palestinians who studied in India, because the Indian government opened and welcomed Palestinians to come and have education that was not afforded in Palestine. And it used its political and standing and relations internationally in order to support the Palestinian cause. Now India, under your prime minister, is essentially a closest ally to Benjamin Netanyahu, right? And that is really concerning. And I think that we have to work together in order to maintain some sort of not only solidarity, but really joint action in order to shift and push back and change it into the point where we were able to present alternatives that provide a protection for all people, that are not going to single out or not put people in one dominating powerful position over the other people.
Thank you so much. Fazal, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here.
I think this is our question we'll be taking. Fazal, can you put your question, please?
Yes, my question is very small. Do you see the Intifada 3 happening soon? What is your take on it?
Yeah, I think, that we had that happening a few years ago too, when we thought that there were an uprising similar to the first Intifada, second Intifada. I think it's clear that it's something new. It's something that has not had the same, when I lived through the first and second Intifada. I wasn't in high school in the first Intifada when it started in 1987. I was a human rights lawyer in 2000 and worked on defending Palestinian rights, including against serious violations of international humanitarian law by Israel in the refugee camps in Jenin refugee camp and camps and other places. And I think that and there were sense of that there could be containing this. There could be some way that we could do something. I think what I'm hearing from friends and colleagues and family members and people who are and from watching is that this is a new reality because it opened all fronts. There's no more the distinction that that Israel attempted to create between 67 West Bank and Gaza and Palestinian citizens. That there's a sense from the Palestinian side of injustice that is now actually unifying them again, just as they were unified in 1948 under the Nakba, when they were dispossessed the first time by Zionist forces. They feel that they are not protected, they're not defended, they are lacking the ability to participate in whatever way to survive and to thrive. And they're seeing that this window of creating some sort of a normal life with Jewish citizens, particularly for Palestinian citizens inside Israel, is really closing. The fact that Israel, just during the COVID, during the pandemic, decided that it would inoculate, it will provide vaccines to all its citizens, including Arab citizens, but would deny Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza vaccines. Clearly a political decision aimed to, and it's also a very dangerous one and misinformed one, because why would you not provide medical support that would, or vaccination to your neighbors, to people who you interact with so closely, that would otherwise put you again at risk of infection. And so we see that the escalation in policies of separation and apartheid, which in a recent report by Human Rights Watch concluded that the state of Israel as a whole has been committed in violations of the prohibition against apartheid and persecution, and finding that there need to be a rigorous and concrete actions on the international level to push back against the system. I really encourage you to read the report. They were not the first organization, certainly the first international organization, maybe at the size of Human Rights Watch, to reach this conclusion, which is critical, but it is an analysis based on laws and policies that were already analyzed and monitored and documented by many Palestinian organizations, human rights organizations, Palestinian scholars, and thinkers and writers, we always said, there is one system here. It's divided into subsystems, and Israel is using different laws, different policies, but the ultimate goal is domination of one group, Israeli Jewish community, over another, or non-Jewish citizens or residents. And that in of itself, I think, is something that is making people, Palestinians all over the country, all over Palestine, unify in raising their voice and say, enough is enough. This system, as sophisticated as it is, need to be challenged, need to be directly confronted. And if we ever wanted to move into a time when our dignity is respected and our access to equal rights as Palestinians who are indigenous to this land. I was on a podcast or a show with a leading indigenous leader, Chase Iron Eyes, in the United States a few days ago. He wanted to interview me about what's going on. And he said on the show, you have to in objecting to these policies, what Israel is doing, don't allow them to turn you into what they turned us, indigenous peoples in America, into reservations, into groups that are completely on the margins of the American and the United States as a whole, and into a community that has been denied its self-determination, governance, and ability to live and to thrive as it was for centuries. And as he said, well, obviously, I think that the atrocities have committed against indigenous nations in North America, but also other parts of the world, but particularly in the United States, are obviously genocidal and much more grave than I think in terms of their implications on what happened really today. But he has a point. The important point is this is exactly what Israeli policies are intended to do, is to make Palestinians surrender, make them give up, leave their homeland, accept a second-class citizenship at best, or some sort of a residency that will give them to enjoy some scraps that are given and as a matter of, not as a matter of a right, but as a matter of a charity. And so I think whether we call it a third intifada or not, I think it's just a semantic. I think the important thing to do is, again, going back to the fundamentals of analyzing well informed by Palestinian experience and a struggle, and connecting to the ability of them to sustain this. And my concern is that because of the lack of Palestinian leadership at the national level, and certainly because of the way that Israel have this fragmented political leadership, what we will see at the end of this is that some sort of a ceasefire that will save Palestinian civilian lives and also attacks on Israel, but it will not address the fundamental root cause problems of what Israel has been perpetrating and instituting for years, and what will be, unfortunately, without leadership, without organizing, without ability to hold it accountable, and shifting the powers, we will be seeing this cycle again. We will see another wave because there will be the same thing while kind of managing the crisis for as long as possible, again, until one side will give up. And I don't think that at this point, any side will give up. I think they're destined to live together. The question is whether you live with dignity, or you live humiliated, you live deprived of your basic rights. And I think Palestinians are clear and steadfast in denying this option of their surrender. They will never surrender, and they will not give up the right to live in dignity as equal people, as equal human beings on their land.
Jamil, I think that last line of yours was just fantastic, it's. I think a few of my colleagues were saying, we see some of it, right? Depends on which media house you're reading from, and it's pretty heartbreaking. But I think the context in which you put a lot of this is very reaffirming. I do hope that we go back to the days, or better days actually, of solidarity, and we hope to see. It was a very interesting moment to see the Palestinian flag fly at the UN a couple of years back, and I thought things were going to get better. But I'm sure that from everybody here, a lot of strength and solidarity. Some of the references that you gave, especially the Human Rights Watch report, has been shared on the chat box. If anybody's interested in further readings, there are a lot of Twitter handles which are sharing ground real-time updates from the ground. That's also shared. And we hope to come back to you, Jamil, sometime soon to hear more from you, and hopefully better news. Thank you so much for giving us this time. I really did, but 2 hours on a Saturday morning when you have so much on your plate. Thank you so much. And to everybody else who joined in on a Saturday evening, thank you so much again.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the support and the solidarity, and please be well and stay safe. We'll be in touch for sure.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Thanks.